Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Kvetching with Adam and Jarrod. It's been a while since we've recorded. It was the end of the semester. I submitted grades just the other day. It is done. I just have to show up for graduation tomorrow. And then no pants. Not that I've been wearing pants for the last month or so, but it is summer vacation. And I will now turn things over to my colleague who will introduce himself, Adam, in case you've forgotten who he is.
I am Adam, and I am wearing pants. And I am done as well with the grading, and we actually already had our graduation commencement. So I'm a little bit ahead of the game with ahead of Jarrod on this. But we have a very interesting episode of Kvetching today. We have a great guest who will introduce himself to us right now.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Karp, and I teach Jewish history at Binghamton University, formerly known as SUNY Binghamton. Some people ask me, is Binghamton University, is that near SUNY Binghamton? And, it used to be called SUNY Binghamton, and people still know it by that name. I'm in we have a Judaic Studies department there, and I'm also in the history department. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I just want to, if he doesn't mind, if his ears aren't burning, I want to congratulate Jarrod on his promotion that he just learned about. That's
Professor, it is done.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Yeah, got the letter from the Board of Regents. No, Board of Trustees. I get the boards all mixed up. So just that your specialty in history, you're really diverse in terms of what you work on, right?
Yeah. I mean, if there's a thread of some kind, it actually is economic history, which is a little bit unusual in Jewish studies, but I'm interested in the economic dimensions of Jewish history, particularly both as a set of stereotypes and constructions and images about Jews informing anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism, and everything in between, but also as a structural, sociological factor that underscores, to a degree, Jewish difference and functionality in Western societies. So that's led me, it overlaps with a long-standing interest in music, in American popular music, and jazz and rhythm and blues. And so the book I've been working on for some time is about Blacks and Jews in the business of popular music in America. And hopefully that'll be out in about a year.
Oh, great. Terrific.
Yeah. And I guess I'm here because I kind of invited myself, I have to say, but you guys seemed willing enough, so I appreciate it. Because I've never really published much on Israel and Zionism, although I'm really interested in it. Zionism is fascinating from many points of view, but from that economic point of view in particular, as a way of solving the economic dimensions of the Jewish problem. But that's not the topic that I wrote a brief article recently on that appeared in the Jewish Review of Books in the winter issue of 2024. And that article was called Anti-Israelism. I wanted to call it Anti-Israelism as a form of racism. The editors just cut out the form of racism part, but was my meaning. And it's an article that propounds a thesis that categories of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, while all too real, do not really capture what's been going on for the last number of decades, and particularly since October 7th, which is a prejudice against all things Israel, I would say. Not, of course, obviously, not criticisms of Israel, which, like any other state, are merited or not merited and are debatable, and nobody would claim that Israel is perfect, far from it. But I'm talking about a fundamental rejection of Israel as an illegitimate entity, of Israeli culture as contaminated by illegitimacy, and of Israelis themselves as expressions or manifestations of this kind of illegitimacy, and not a real people, a sort of artificial people. To the extent that they're a real people, they're the embodiment of the colonial settler project of Western colonialism. I think this is the only way to adequately explain this fever, disease, I would even say, of hostility to Israel in the wake of, especially pronounced in the wake of the greatest tragedy to befall it in its existence as a state. You'd think that there would be at least a period of respectful sympathy, but in many cases that wasn't true. It was in some cases, for sure. I'm not tarring everybody with this brush,
It
but
lasted about 4 days. Yeah,
it seemed to last about 4 days, and it was quickly followed by this rash of hostility and denunciation before even Israel had even really responded militarily to the atrocities committed by Hamas. So I don't want to just go on a monologue here, but that was the gist of the piece, and it was actually part of a roundtable discussion. It's funny, but perhaps telling, that another scholar, a classic scholar who is an Israeli but who teaches at Stanford, named Reviel Netz, wrote a piece along the same lines, somewhat along the same lines. I mean, we differ in important ways, but he also wrote a piece in which he said anti-Semitism doesn't capture what's going on, and this is a hatred of things Israeli and Israeliness. So the editors of JRB, Abe Socher, put the two together, and then responded to both of them individually and jointly, somewhat critically, asserting that anti-Semitism, are these really new phenomena? Are they just new expressions of an old phenomenon, anti-Semitism? And that kind of argument can go around forever. But it has gotten a lot of attention and interest, and I'm hoping to write a longer, more analytical and considered iteration of it sometime soon.
Yeah, no, it's a terrific piece. And was Abe Socher the one who cut your title, by the way? Was he the one
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's a tough editor, right? I published
Yes, he's a
about
good
5
editor.
years ago. Yeah, I think I put more work into the revisions than I have into any peer-reviewed article I've ever written.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, but absolutely, and JRB gets great circulation, so I'm sure a lot of people have read it and given you feedback on it. Now, it's interesting. Obviously, we want to talk about the distinction, why anti-Semitism is not a useful category here, despite the fact that there is overlap, right? As you mentioned in your piece yourself, they are using tropes that are anti-Semitic tropes. They're just refashioned, using the progressive jargon that chooses to use Zionism instead. And they do use the word Zionism, not Israelism. That film, Israelism, is an exception, though. It seems to be they're perhaps moving in that direction as well. And there's also the question, I kept lingering when I was reading it. It says, but once you're talking about an entity that is home to half of the world's Jews, I mean, it's sort of anti-Semitic by default. If you're calling for the elimination of the place that houses, and the outcome is going to be violent, whether that's their intention or not, it will be violent. Then at that point, it's almost a matter of semantics at that point.
And I think to some extent it is a matter of semantics, and but at the same time, I think it's a question of diagnosis, of analytical diagnosis of a phenomenon. And if we call it anti-Semitism, then I think it's too broad a canvas, because I do think that a lot of people who express this hatred are not they're not actually anti-Semites, except in a you'd have to it's a sort of 2 steps or 3-step logical progression you'd have to get to. So where you'd say like, well, so you think Israel shouldn't exist. So why? Because they're interlopers. They're occupying somebody else's land. So you think that that Jews shouldn't have. You're anti-Zionist because you think that Zionism is an imperialistic ideology. Okay, so then you uniquely single out Zionism as every form of among all forms of nationalism, and you say that Jews are not entitled to national self-determination. Aha, you're an anti-Semite, or that's anti-Semitic. And I'm not dismissing that argument, but I think it's the symptom, whether the cause ultimately is anti-Semitism. And I'm not sure I'm willing to concede that generally, but I'm willing to concede it for argument's sake for the moment provisionally, even if it's true. In other words, the symptom is anti-Israelism. Absolutely, there's a lot of blowback against Jews. There are a lot of attacks. Unfortunately, there has been an upsurge, a significant upsurge in attacks on Jews in Europe and in the United States as well. But I think the brunt of the attacks have been on Israelis and things Israeli. So if you don't identify the object, the specific object of hatred, of rejection, then I think you're misdiagnosing the problem. Even if ultimately that problem derives in some remote sense from anti-Semitism, and even if some of the libels cast on Israel and Israelis resemble ones that in the past historically have been directed at Jews.
Well, I agree with you, but I don't entirely agree, or want to kind of push you on this a little. I don't think that when such people are thinking of Israel, they're thinking of the Muslim population or the Druze or the Bedouins. They're thinking about the Jews.
Yeah, that's true. Probably true. Although Hamas was indiscriminate in its attacks and absolutely killed Druze and killed Arabs and killed other foreigners, whether as Israelis or in their minds as collaborators.
Yeah, but they kill the Palestinian tribes that are not. They
They
kill
did.
Hamas members.
Yeah, but as an attack in the context of this attack on, it's not who they kill in general. They're willing to kill all kinds of people, especially their own. But I mean on October 7th. But at the same time, the attacks were so yes, I agree that the identification of Israeli by a group like Hamas is with Jews. That's true. But I want to shift the ground just a little bit. Being an Israeli is not synonymous with being a Jew. Maybe it is in the mind of Hamasniks, but my point, or part of my point, is the reality of Israel is of a multicultural, multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Yes, it is overwhelmingly an expression of Jewish nationalism or the Jewish nation, but it has taken on such a different and unique character that it doesn't entirely resemble anything that has existed before in Jewish history. And I think that that difference is qualitative, not just quantitative. Sure, you could say, well, how is that different from American Jews being different from every other diaspora Jewish community or Russian Jews or whatever? My argument is that Israel is a unique phenomenon in Jewish history that is unprecedented, and we as historians haven't paid quite enough attention to that disjuncture.
But what about the fact it's just Israel is just the modern contemporary vehicle of Jewish power, And every era has something that anti-Semites look at as being emblematic of Jewish power and Jewish influence.
And it's also, it's not a question of whether Israel in reality is something unique. It's a question of what the attackers against Israel, how they conceptualize Israel, right?
That's true.
It's,
That's
in David Hirsch's book, Anti-Zionism, he refused to put a hyphen in there. He, got rid of the hyphen and put a small Z because he said what they're doing is not.
But such people hate Israel if it was not a Jewish state.
So that's the big question here. Why Israel? Of all the places in the world, if we're going to say there's a disconnect with anti-Semitism, how did it happen that of all the countries that were built by what they call settler colonialism that emerged through partitions that were not agreed upon and in the mid 1940s, why this one?
Well, you have to remember that there was a period when Israel was not universally denounced. There was a period when Israel was widely admired. And that period lasted at least into the 1960s and sometimes beyond. And Israel still is admired among various non-Jewish communities and countries and parts of the world. America being the most important case. In America, Israel is still a popular and admired country amongst the vast majority of the U.S. population. But your question is a totally fair and good one. Why Israel? I think, yes, it's because it is an expression of the Jewish, and there's no way to, whenever you're talking about Jews, in especially a Christian, but perhaps even to some extent in a Muslim mindset, Jews have a special theological significance. They're never just a group of people or any group of people. They represent some cosmic teleology, that is part of some larger historical narrative or mythical narrative that people believe in. So I definitely think that that's a part of it. But I also think that it is one of the last kind of polities that could be, say, plausibly identified as a Western colonial. I don't believe it fits into the colonialist model, but I can see how people fit it in. And I think that it sort of is if we can just overturn Israel, will be finished with Western colonialism. There is an almost Marxist idea that this is the bourgeoisie that has to be the last vestige of the bourgeoisie. So Israel occupies,
and the Palestinians are the proletariat,
and they're the proletariat,
exactly.
And you have to get behind them, and this is the last stage in the struggle. So it plausibly, really implausibly, but plausibly passes for the last instance of a major instance of Western colonialism. And so all of the focus is no longer Africa. It's no longer Indochina. All of those battles have been, in a sense, won or superseded. There's only one that is left. And I think that plays a role. And I also think, and I argue in the piece, that if it is anti-Semitism, it's an inversion in a curious way of anti-Semitic stereotypes, that Israel upsets the assumptions of what Jews are and how they behave. Israel as an aggressive, assertive, muscular sort of power violates all that people like Jarrod and I hold dear in Jewish identity: the schlemiel, the weakling, the victim. Israel refuses. In the Nebish, Israel refuses to be a victim. And so there may be a legacy of anti-Semitism that finds that empowered Jew intolerable, particularly galling. So I think, again, even if I'm only partly right, and there's more anti-Semitism in the equation than I was willing to give credit to, it still is a new formulation that I think unless, as I said before, to repeat myself, unless we diagnose it correctly, we're not getting at the heart. And there's a whole other side to this, which I haven't mentioned yet, of course, which is that, and the three of us know about it, which is that are we really going to call the many, many Jews who are participating in anti-Israelism, are we really going to call them anti-Semites? Are we going to call them self-hating Jews? I note that that unlike the classic sort of idea of the self-hating Jew, these aren't people who try to hide their Jewish identity. They're broadcasting their Jewish identity and weaponizing it against Israel.
I have to make notes because I've got questions about literally every second sentence that you have here.
Okay,
That's good.
everything I'm saying raises
They're
a
called
possible objection
they're called as a Jews.
as a Jew. I
Right.
like that. And we're not just talking about, people who are nominally Jews, but also people who are professionally Jews. We know many of them in our own field of Jewish studies, and even Israel studies have become bastions of anti-Israelism. I just find it perverse to label such people, and we all know who they are, and we don't have to name names, to label such people anti-Semites. I mean,
Although not all of them broadcast the fact that they're Jewish. Like Norman Finkelstein, I won't name him. I guess it's okay to name him. I don't think ever refers to himself as Jewish.
How many non-Jews Jews named Finkelstein do you know?
He always says that his parents died in the Holocaust.
well, they didn't die in the Holocaust. I know Norman personally.
Uh-huh.
Used to hang out with him in my bad old days, and certainly his mother lived well into his 40s. She
Maybe
was
he says that they're victims of the Holocaust or something like that.
okay, but he it's he wears his Jewishness absolutely on his sleeve.
His name's Finkelstein. I mean, it's like I posted about that guy Soloveitchik today.
He
You're not
didn't
getting
change his name.
around.
No, he's a good example of somebody who and I've spoken with. I don't want to resort to private conversations, but I've spoken with him many times about his seders and about this and about that, and there's no question. I mean, he's a very disturbed person, but at the same time, a brilliant person, no question about it. But he's not the example that I'm thinking of. That's a special case.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Jewish historians of Jews, Jewish studies scholars, to one degree or another, who have become pretty militantly anti-Israel. And so obviously that's, it's a reductio ad absurdum. Are we really going to say that those people are anti-Semites? No. We need a different category to understand what they are doing. They are actually, as I said, using their Jewishness in order to discredit Israel as a wrong turn in Jewish history, a terrible wrong turn that still could be remedied. And so that's why I think anti-Semitism, those are some of its failings in accounting for what's going on.
Okay, so I feel like I'm at a conference and I just heard a great talk and I have to get all my questions packed in there before everyone starts putting up their hands. So, but I'm just going to mention two for the moment that directly address what you're saying here. One of them, I'll mention the first one because this one probably won't lead to as much of a conversation. In terms of Jewish power versus traditional stereotypes, you addressed one part of the response to that is that there's this fear of Jewish power. And I think that is a major element in Israel hatred. The very idea of Jews exercising power, the ones who aren't the Shlemiel. I made that argument about the Odessan Jews in my book on Odessa. They're just like that, right? Except they actually have a good sense of humor. So the thing also, though, along with this Jewish power is they've resorted to traditional stereotypes of Jewish power because 19th century anti-Semitism was ultimately about Jewish power. It just wasn't about physical power. But that's why Jewish Voice for Peace, came up with the deadly exchange, the idea that we are Israel's covertly training policing forces at all level in the U.S. so they can engage in racial profiling and therefore keep white supremacists in power. I mean, that's the very same idea that's in the protocols. It's the flip side of Jews will not replace us. We're not trying to use physical power or to take power ourselves, but it's from the shadows. So that does find its way in there because my personal belief is it does resonate. It does strike a chord in people, for historical reasons. Now, the other thing about the Jewish self-hatred, and I did send you the thing I wrote last night, and I've done a lot of thinking about it. And I really think, no, I don't think self-hatred doesn't work if we're looking at traditional self-hatred, because people like Weininger and people like that, they wanted to completely escape from being Jewish, right? The ones who we're talking about today, these academics, they don't want to escape from being Jewish. They just hate the current incarnation of the Jew as represented by Israel. And what they want to do is refashion Jewishness in an image that's acceptable to them. You can make an argument that they're doing it because it's an image that's acceptable to the non-Jews, but that's, we could debate whether that's the case. But certainly they want to refashion Jews in their image. So I think a much better analogy with them is the Yevsektia in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, who I will not call anti-Semites. I definitely will not call them anti-Semites, and that's more for historical context reasons, because they genuinely brought about Jewish emancipation in the context of the USSR. Whereas it's not needed today. We're already emancipated. But they wanted to refashion Jewishness in an image that was acceptable to the Soviet government and to a future communist utopia.
Well, let's deal with both of these issues one at a time, right?
Okay, yeah, but let me just finish the sentence. Let me finish my sentence.
Jarrod, it's not a conference, right?
Well, look, see, I'm already getting an interrupter from the audience over here. So, but the thing is, again, with the Yevsektia, it's, religion, Zionism, bad, 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 working class Yiddish culture, good. Let's elevate those things. A self-hating Jew is not going to go out and speak Yiddish in the streets and start demanding people start speaking Yiddish in the street. They're not going to do that. So those are the two. We could deal with them one at a time. I know Adam's having trouble keeping them both in his head at once.
So those are, Adam, do you want to chime in?
Well, I'll just say one thing about that point about the self-hatred issue. What would you say to this? That they don't hate the Jews, right? "Quote unquote" the Jews as a distinct identity, as a people, but they hate most Jews, right? That's the fact.
They? Who's they? Sorry.
These anti-Israelists that you're talking about, these Jewish anti-Israelists if they hate Israel, they hate, half of world Jewry.
But we're redeemable if we renounce Zionism, right? There is a litmus test, that in theory we can pass, right? So it's not, again, looking at Nazism.
I don't know how you could watch like that Israelism film, that Simone Zimmerman film, and not come away with it thinking this is an anti-Semitic movie, right? That's spreading all kinds of blatantly dishonest libels about the Jewish people. And this is a film made by Jews, about Jews.
Yeah, I would cite, a recent article in Haaretz about the culture at Columbia University for Israelis there. And what you have in many cases, Columbia seemed like a good place to be an Israeli. New York City is a good place to be an Israeli. And Columbia, with its opportunities, with its prestige, with its science and technology and humanistic studies, was a kind of a magnet for Israeli graduate students. And now, and there are some exceptions that are important. This isn't by any means universal, but now there is a culture where if you're speaking Hebrew, especially with an Israeli accent, if you're noticeably or recognizably Israeli, I mean, if you're speaking English with an Israeli accent, you're very likely to be ostracized.
Who wrote this article?
I'll have to send it to you, or
you mentioned that in your article.
Oh, you did?
This came out, no, this came out a couple of weeks ago. I do mention cases of BDS, and I think BDS is an excellent
Well,
example.
you do bring up the example of Israelis being very
Yes, I
careful
do.
speaking Hebrew outside of their country.
I do, and that's been borne out and magnified in the last several months. And the article also refers to a roommate, a Jewish roommate, who insisted that they were going to move out because they couldn't live with an Israeli. Um, you know, we have many cases of Israeli artists being canceled. These can be Mizrahi Israelis. They can be Israelis who themselves are anti-Zionist or very so critical of Israel that the line between legitimate criticism and anti-Zionism is pretty blurred. The Israeli left, as you know, can be a very fundamentally critical
Was
of.
that student, was that at Columbia?
Yeah, that was at
Because
Columbia.
a colleague of ours, and this was a public post, so I could mention his name, Zachary Breiterman, posted that a student of his
Yeah.
faced the same situation, but near as I can tell from his post, that student wasn't Israeli even. It was just an American Jew.
Yeah. Um, but for who is a supporter of Israel, you know, I have family members who were involved in J Street at Columbia, and were ostracized. Not only would people on the left not talk to them, but even people who were simply not particularly political, recognizing that J Street was a pro-Zionist organization, refused to have any contact. Um, and another article. Also in Haaretz. Um, it's the title of it is very heartbreaking. I have it in front of me. It's called "We're Persona Non Grata, Almost Satan: Global Boycott of Israeli Culture Ratchets Up." And this is about uh, writers refusing to have their work translated into Hebrew. Um, you know, Jewish and non-Jewish writers. This is about filmmakers having their debuts canceled at international film festivals, about musicians who had been Israeli musicians who had been well integrated into the music world, suddenly finding themselves isolated and kicked out. So there's something going on. It has been significantly intensified by October 7th, but it really isn't new. It goes back to the BDS movement and movements akin to that. And those movements, again, we can say they're anti-Semitic, but first and foremost, they are anti-Israeli, and they are anti-everything about Israel, not anti-occupation, not aiming to create a Palestinian state alongside Israel, which is something I support, but they are, we don't want no two-state, we want 1948. I mean, it's a stupid slogan because 1948, there, even in the beginning of 1948, before the state was declared, the Yishuv had established, was in the process of establishing military supremacy. So obviously they're not too historically well informed. What they really want is 1916 before the Balfour Declaration, but it doesn't rhyme with two-state.
Actually,
So
Adam said today, really, they want to go back to the first Yishuv. They
I want to go back to the old Yishuv.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we have to, you know, I remember
They want to
again,
go back before the First World Zionist Congress.
yeah, they do. And the only Jews that they will say are acceptable are those who can prove descent from people who lived there either prior to the Balfour Declaration or prior to the First Zionist Congress, or Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews who lived in Palestine at that time. So for all of these reasons, um, I think the tool of anti-Semitism is too crude to get at what's going on here. And again, if it were just something that evolved from October 7th, you could say, well, this isn't much different from what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. Not that that's an analogous case because Russia attacked Ukraine, whereas Israel was attacked. But leaving that aside, Russian writers and scholars and this and that might be canceled. But we're talking about a campaign that has been going on for a very, very long time that has only been intensified. And I want to add one more thing, which is that if it is a form of anti-Semitism, it's a tolerated form of anti-Semitism. It's even an encouraged form of anti-Semitism. You can be racist when it comes to Israelis. You can be racist. If racism is a automatic, prejudicial, ontologically based rejection of a people, whether they constitute a race or not. Obviously, there's probably no such thing as a race. This is in the eyes of the beholder. But whether they constitute this is racism. And it's okay to say that. It's okay for academics. It's okay for scientists. It's okay for university presidents. It's okay for people from all walks of life to express anti-Israelism with impunity. In fact, with encouragement from respectable opinion.
But it's also okay now because of that to take it out on American Jews, right? You now see calls for BDS against Hillel houses on campuses.
But they say that's because of Hillel's political stance, right? That they're
Right, yeah. So any American Jew that supports Israel in any way is now allowed to be hated.
No, but you see what John's saying here, and I think this is an important point, is Hillel is making an ideological choice, one obviously that we support. But if you happen to be born in Israel and you happen to have an Israeli passport because that's where you happen to live, and you haven't voiced any political opinions whatsoever, and you're targeted, you go into the music business and you're just trying to play violin in New York, and you're targeted for that reason, then that is racism, right?
I have a hard time believing, though, that Druze or Bedouins or any Islamic, any Israeli Arab traveling outside of Israel faces this kind of discrimination. They're probably treated with pity. They're probably said something like this, said to them to the effect that, "Oh, I'm very sorry that you have to experience what you have to experience. It stinks that you have to live there."
It's a good point. It's worth looking into, Adam. I think that's an important thing to investigate. But I suspect that most people who dislike Israel or reject or hate Israel don't have that level of discernment. First of all, they just assume that all Israelis are Jews, because that's a component of what I would call anti-Israelism. Not recognizing what Israel is and its complexity and its richness, in its legitimacy as a country with good and bad, and diversity. And there are many patriotic Druze. I mean, Druze are extremely
they serve the IDF.
Absolutely. And my family lives in Israel. My partner and our daughter, we have a very long distance relationship. So I'm there a lot of the time, and I'm here a lot of the time, and they're here, vice versa. But my daughter goes to a public school in Tel Aviv. She's starting middle school next year, and she has had Palestinian, not Druze, but Palestinian Israeli teachers. Their doctors are Palestinians. Palestinians are increasingly well integrated into Israeli society. It's not something that you hear about, especially in the economy, especially in certain professions, medical, pharmaceutical, to some extent, educational, high tech, increasingly. And so I think that those Palestinian Israelis have a stake in Israeli society. There may be a lot of social pressure on them not to admit it, but they likely recognize that their situation is in many ways better than that of other Arabs in neighboring lands. And I think one hopes, and I do hope that the nation state law will be reformed or revoked, because I think it was an attack on non-Jewish Israelis.
How
But
much of a
one,
tangible impact has that law had? Has it?
you know, I I'm not an expert, but my impression from reading around the literature is that there was a sense that things are really moving in the right direction. There are a lot of important Supreme Court cases that were asserting Palestinians' rights under the law, their full equal civic rights. And I think the nation state law was a reaction against that.
Mhm.
And I think it was an important psychological step backward.
I don't agree with you on that one, but we could save that for another
Okay,
discussion.
yeah, well, we might be getting off topic a little
Right,
bit, but
right.
yeah,
Mhm.
But it's psychological, though. I mean, I think that's an important point.
yeah.
Mhm.
So,
I have a question, kind of a
sure.
slight tangent, but on the main issue though. So what do you make of that there's a certain kind of prejudice against Israel? I think even among Israel's friends, or at least a lot of them, treat Israel as like a teenager that is still on probation, that has to check in
Yeah,
with us before they make a decision. You know what I'm talking
Who do
about?
you mean by
totally.
friends, Adam? Who do you mean by friends?
Well, I'm referring to um, the American government, Joe
Mhm.
Biden.
Right.
Well, I think Joe Biden's in a tricky place if we're talking about him. It's a balancing act that he has to perform. I think if he
But
had a
I don't just mean Joe Biden. I mean
okay.
much of the foreign policy establishment.
There is a paternalism about Israel, even from its American friends and its supporters, um, which basically says, "Yeah, we see your point of view, but you're going too far. You're not sort of exercising self-discipline." And it's a very rich hypocrisy, I think, coming from a country that was never attacked by Vietnam. I mean, was there an attack on Vietnam? I don't recall that happened. There was that there was the blowing up of a ship, but that turned out to be a self-sabotage. Um,
I
uh,
think that there's a sense, though, that even broader than that, that Israel exists at the privilege of the United States and the West.
Well, yeah, yeah, and sometimes I think that Israeli political leaders, and I guess you're supposed to say I'm not a supporter of the current government. I'm not. It's not just something I'm saying, but I do feel that sometimes I hear Netanyahu is sort of get his back up and say, hey, we have to do what we think is best for our country, not what we think is best for the United States. Yeah, Israel is very dependent on the US, and in some ways it's a proxy of the US, and we have to acknowledge that. It functions that way in the geopolitics of the Middle East. But ultimately, this is another feature of Israeliness that I think is part of, could fit into my analysis, which is that ultimately Israel can't obey any rules that are imposed upon it by others for purposes of appearances, for purposes of propriety. It has to do what it needs to do to survive. And not to necessarily go beyond that, but to do what it needs to do to survive. And this idea that it should be extra special good behavior, because if you want to enjoy our favors, you have to dance by our rules. I think is something that many Israelis understand intellectually, but they can't accept in the last resort. And I feel sympathetic
Well,
to
they
them.
also know because they also know that they do a lot for the West
Absolutely.
that we don't acknowledge.
I
Like,
mean,
we Americans tend to think it's a one-way street.
you're totally right. I think it's a great point, Adam, and I think Iran is a really good case. I mean, Israel is on the forefront of trying to keep Iran in check, and that is something that is totally in the U.S. interests. And the U.S. needs Israel to be that sort of front avant-garde, that front guard in this battle, because Iran really is the instrument of so much of the hostility and hatred in conflict in the Middle East right now, particularly surrounding Israel. And part of the focus on Israel, even from its friends, deflects attention from Iran, which is in many ways the real story. I mean, we're
Do
talking
you think
geopolitics, but yeah.
do you think much of this hatred for Israel is an expression of anti, quote, Western civilization, for lack of a better term? A lot of people are making that claim now.
Yeah, I think it's again pretty ironic that Israel, a country created by a people that were almost entirely destroyed by within Western civilization, that are refugees from Western civilization in some way, but also embodied some of its best values, um, is persecuted for that, or is despised as a representative of the West. But yeah, I do think that there's some element of that. Obviously, the hatred of Israel is complex and multifaceted, and any attempt to reduce it to a formula is oversimplifying. But we have to begin somewhere.
You say in your piece that this is something new, regardless of whether we want to call it anti-Semitism or not. But is this not like the way it was in the Soviet Union in the 60s and the 70s? I mean, they voiced their contempt for Zionism, subjected the Jews to litmus tests, and granted it's under an authoritarian regime. If people exercise their free speech or their allegiance to Zionism, they would get in serious trouble. They would lose their jobs, and they could even be incarcerated if it came down to it in some cases. But the way they articulated their contempt for Israel is very similar to what we heard today.
If we were to try to construct a lexicon of anti-Israelism, which I think actually would be a useful thing to do, I think we would draw heavily from Soviet imagery and vocabulary. I do think that that is one of the interesting sort of fonts of anti-Israelism. What's fascinating is that even after the fall of communism, even if it is no longer central to Russian identity, it has been exported not only to the Middle East but to the West as well.
Yeah. I think we're getting close to the hour, but you have one very important point in your piece that just kind of gets mentioned as an aside, and as historians.
Can I just say, can I add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to say, and maybe you were gonna. I should let you finish. I'm sorry,
No,
but
it's okay. Go ahead.
thank you. I feel that I had a lot of anti-Israelism in myself, coming from a kind of Jewish left orientation and a Marxist orientation, and having that, here I'm talking about the particular Jewish form of anti-Israelism as opposed to a non-Jewish form of anti-Israelism, but coming from a very Zionist background where I felt like I was misled about the nature of Israel. And once I learned the truth about Israel, I was disenchanted and angry at all of those teachers and parents who had steered me wrong and foisted this falsehood on me, and I was angry at them. And I think that's the experience of many Jewish Jews who are who've become extremely hostile to Israel. So I was very susceptible to that, and prone to that. And it took me a long time and a lot of exposure to Israeli society to gradually divest myself of those feelings. And I have to tell you that it was in part because I came to appreciate Israel as a complex society, but also in some ways as a very admirable society. You know, Joshua Moravchik, who's a neocon.
He's a
Uh,
signer of our statement also, by the way.
oh, good.
Oh,
Good.
did he?
He's a good guy. He wrote this, I think, important book called Making David into Goliath. But he also wrote another book in which he talked about Israel as a liberal oasis. He says Israel embodies, in terms of its sexual attitudes, in terms of its healthcare system, in terms of aspects of its economy and institutional life, it embodies a lot of things that liberals and leftists value highly. And if they were able to look at it objectively and clear their heads from their prejudices, they would recognize that. And I really think that's true. And I hope that I was able to clear my head of some of those prejudices. And then that made me ask myself, well, if that's true, if it is mostly in many ways an admirable society, why this uh, hostility? Why this hatred? So that made me try to think about some of the reasons behind it. I interrupted you, Jarrod, but I just
That
want to
actually segues nicely into it because you mentioned that one of the original goals of Zionism was to end anti-Semitism, and I mean, you know, Pinsker wrote this, as did other
right,
proto-Zionists and then Zionists, that if only the Jews, you know, achieved a state of normalcy, you know, normalization of the Jews, you know, a project since the Enlightenment, right? But in this
right,
case, we establish a state. If we're a nation just like everyone else, there would be no reason to hate us anymore, which of course was not the only goal of Zionism, but it was, you know,
yeah,
the important ones. I remember John Efron bringing that up in a seminar one day and just saying, and dot, 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 you know, so much for that, so much for that
yeah,
achievement. So, I mean, that again raises the original question, you know, to the
yeah.
source of all this, because we did check off that box. We're not walking around as an anomaly anymore. We have a state and we have a diaspora. It just might have come into being in reverse order than it usually does. You know, it's not like there was an Ireland and then they made their way to the United States. We went back and built the state.
Well, there are two things that I think should be said in response to that. First, the creation of Israel by no means ended anti-Semitism. And it may, and we may be seeing that it contributes to anti-Semitism in various ways, or it revivifies some forms of anti-Semitism. And I would go even further, and this may seem to undermine my own thesis, but I think it just makes it a little more complex and nuanced. Um, Attitudes towards Israel seem to borrow from a vocabulary of anti-Semitic motifs through the ages. You've mentioned some, and I would mention another one, misanthropy, which is even a pre-Christian form of anti-Jewishness from antiquity. The idea that Jews hate all the world
Right.
and are against everybody, mankind. And you can see applications of that to anti-Israelism. So that's one side of it. And I think that really requires a lot of thought and careful analysis. But the other side of it is that you have a state, you have an army, you have a society which has a great deal of solidarity, even though it also has fissures in it. And that state is capable of fighting for itself. And I think that that's a big difference. It's a difference from all of those instances where Jews seem to have power, and you know they had economic power, they had influence behind the scenes, etc. Even aside from fantasies about them, they really did have some degree of power in a diasporic context.
Mhm.
Here we have power in a national context, and I think I think we always have to remember that and see that that is a sea change. Um, and it changes the equation even for anti-Semitism in the rest of the world.
And
It's kind of
it's an
like
achievement of Zionism, right? Zionism was able to, that was also an objective of Zionism, and
Exactly.
that actually worked.
It did. It's Zionism succeeded. We haven't talked at all about the term anti-Zionism and why that's not, why I haven't emphasized it, or I've de-emphasized it in favor of anti-Israelism. But but the simple answer is that I think Zionism is almost moot. It succeeded. It was a remarkable success. Few ideologies. One can't think of Marxism and communism or many other utopian or near utopian ideologies that succeeded on the level of Zionism. And so we shouldn't be having a conversation about Zionism. We should be having a conversation about Israel. Israel is the expression of the success of Zionism.
Right, absolutely.
It's kind of like Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews.
Yeah,
You know, when people think of a Jew, they think of Anne Frank. That's what they
yeah,
want to
the
think of.
victim.
They don't want to think of Moshe Dayan.
Exactly. Or Yoni Netanyahu.
Right,
You know.
right.
Though
Mhm.
Moshe Dayan had an eye patch, he could check off the disability
Yeah,
checkbox in his
you know.
DEI form. So that's something.
Yeah. And you know, there is a sense that or at least the accusation against Israel is that they exploit the memory of the Holocaust for their nefarious ends. But I would argue that actually they go beyond it. They move beyond it with their commitment to success, far more than any of Israel's critics who want to just look at dead Jews as the
Yeah.
emblematic.
One of the things that just struck me, and it seems so obvious when I thought about it, but it wasn't obvious until I kind of thought about it, just traveling to Israel so often and saying they built this in 75 years, or there was a yeshuv beforehand, but a relatively short time, this high-tech, um, uh, incredibly sophisticated society, highly successful. It's a remarkable accomplishment. We used to learn about it in my Jewish day school. They made the desert bloom, and then later on I came to say, oh, that's just a lot of propaganda. But actually, it is true.
Yeah.
It is true.
They built a collective farm successfully while Stalin
Yeah.
killed 5 million people trying to build one. I mean,
Exactly. The kibbutz, although people think that it was destroyed by the resurgence of capitalism and all kinds of crises, but the kibbutz spirit is not absent from Israeli culture and society in a broad sense. It really is a very special thing um, that has had a salutary effect on society as a whole. It's one of the things I admire about Israel. People do take care of each other there. Amos Oz once was asked, why do you, all the difficulty of being in Israel? And he said, I have nothing against other countries and I don't want to be a chauvinist, but I somehow feel that if I fell down in an Israeli street, somebody would come and help me. And I'm
I
not so sure.
I actually did fall down in an Israeli street,
and
and
someone helped you?
yeah, I fell down in the shuk.
Amazing. In the Jerusalem.
Yeah, and people
Yeah.
came around and helped me get up. Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I fell down several times in Israel. One time
You,
in the
you should
in
be more careful.
yeah, I guess yeah,
you fall down in Ohio?
I must have
Okay, well,
at least
so
one.
it's not an Israel thing.
My
Well,
friend fell down at
the hotel in Jerusalem had a pool of water that I slipped and fell on, and I had to go to the hospital, and there was an Arab doctor that helped mend me up and everything.
Which hotel was it?
What's that?
Which hotel?
Which hotel was it? I'm not going to tell you the hotel, but the hospital though was the Hadassah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
The
know
hotel is a state secret for some reason. Okay.
I
Yeah.
know people who when they have a little time off, go down to the Be'eri or other kibbutzim that were destroyed, and even though there's no one there, they sweep out the rooms. They try to put things in order. You know, that's part of Israeli culture too. There's a sense of um, every Israeli is responsible for every other Israeli. It's an idealization, but I think that it is realized in a meaningful way.
Well, is,
It is.
Israel is a family.
It is a family. Um, And
A
yeah,
very Jewish family, but yeah.
yeah. Like a lot of families, there's a lot of internal, bickering, but absolutely. And my hope is that this is a family that can extend and is extending beyond simply Israeli Jews. And I think that's true. I've seen interviews with Palestinians, even non-Druze Palestinians who serve in police forces. They may not serve in the IDF, but they often serve in municipal police forces, Palestinian Israelis, and talking about serving in the aftermath of 10/7 and doing what they could to try to take care of people who were wounded and injured. And it's very touching. And you felt like they were members of this family too.
Mhm.
Definitely. Well, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. And anti-Israelism is a term that we should definitely embrace, or at the very least interrogate to a greater extent than we have been, especially since the anti-Israelists seem to be using it now with films such as Israelism. So it is very much on the table. Any last words, Adam? Anything to wrap up?
Is anti-Israelism a better term than Zionophobia?
Well, that goes back to what he said about Zionism, right?
Yeah, because I think Zionism is an ideology. It's a political ideology, and Israelism is an ontology. It's a state of being. And I think that gets to the racism issue that we talked about a while ago. So that's one of the reasons I prefer anti-Israelism, although God knows we don't need another, neologist term to bring in and complicate everything.
Well,
Right.
we will give the title of this episode the full one that got axed at the Jewish review.
Thank you.
So what was it? It was anti-Israelism
As a form of racism.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we could definitely use that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
My
this
pleasure.
is the three of us, two historians and one political scientist. I always have to underscore your outsiderness. Adam. Are you part Canadian? I just need to throw that out there. Or do you have any connection to Canada? I don't know. I've always associated you with Canada for some reason. Did you do a degree there? Jonathan?
Oh, me? No.
Yeah, you didn't? I don't know why I've
No.
always thought you were Canadian or something, or had some connection.
I take that from a Canadian. I'll take that as a compliment.
Absolutely.
I do love Gordon Lightfoot. I don't know,
Yeah, Gordon Lightfoot's
that
great.
qualifies me.
You're thinking of me. I took a degree in Canada.
Yeah, I understand that on the West Coast. All right. Well, this is the three of us signing off. Thank you for a wonderful episode.
Thank you.